Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to Leica. Also, thank you to Aperture, of course, who is the publisher of this book we're here to talk about today. I don't know if everybody can see it, but it's called I'm So Happy You Are Here. I'm so happy you're all here. This is like a self-fulfilling title, but it's about Japanese women photographers from the 1950s to now. I'm joined by my co-editor and contributor, Pauline Vermare, who is also the Philip and Edith Leonian Curator of Photography at the Brooklyn Museum, and also another essayist contributor and a member of the editorial committee, Carrie Cushman. And Carrie Cushman is the Edith Dale Monson Gallery Director and Curator at the Hartford Art School. And as I mentioned, part of the editorial committee, this was a project that really required the proverbial village. It took quite a team, including an editorial committee. There's three of you in front of you right now, three of us in front of you right now. We were also joined by Kelly Midori McCormick, who is a writing partner and researcher with Carrie, and maybe Carrie, you can talk to us more about that process, and Takeuchi Mariko, who is a photography critic, curator, and professor at the Kyoto University of the Arts. So, yeah, there's amazing other contributors. I'll go through, I'm going to just introduce the project and this concept of why and how we talk about women photographers, and then I'll turn it over to Pauline and Carrie each, who will sort of touch on some of the top notes of their research and writing for this project. And I wanted to sort of think back. I was planning this talk and started to think about this idea of exploring the canon of Japanese women photographers, and how that's almost a little bit oxymoronic in thinking about the existence of a canon of women, especially in Japan. Just to note that the history of Japanese photography within Japan has been well researched, well told, has really gotten a lot of recognition here in the United States, in Europe, mostly through several very well-known Japanese male photographers. This is one of the touchstones of the history of Japanese photography within Japan. It's a 40-volume set that was published in the late 90s, and of the 40, there are not a single women photographers in that set. So that's, relatively recent to have that kind of a gap. Looking at the way that the history has been told in the US, another touchstone for how Americans have learned about the history of Japanese photography is this show by John Sarkowski and Shoji Yamagishi. So am I getting that correct? Am I remembering correctly? Okay, this is what I would do throughout the project, is check in with my colleagues. Do I have this correct? This was in 1974, and it presented 15 photographers, actually exactly 50 years ago this year. None of them were women photographers. And then, so I was just thinking about this in relation to the idea of canon. I'm not alone in doing so. In fact, this year in Japan, one of the contributors to this project, Mark Fustel, also put together a little bit of a restorative re-examination of that time period as marked by the 1974 exhibition, New Japanese Photography, and sort of reinserted or took a closer look at who were some of the active women photographers at that time who could have been included, including most of whom, all of whom are mentioned in this book. So, we have a lot of real resources for thinking and learning about the history of Japanese photography. Ann Tucker from the Museum of Fine Arts I'm glad to say that in each of these volumes, For a New World to Come by Yasufumi Nakamori and Ravens and Red Lipstick by Lena Fritsch, each one we sort of have a progressive expanding upon of this history, including more and more women. But it's really been, as we started this project, something that we talked a lot about and thought, what is this idea that what are we confronting here in peeling back the layers of history to include women, not just contemporarily, but all the way back through the history of the medium in Japan. And I thought, of course, about Linda Nochlin, who in her very famous essay, and actually was first published in 1971 in Art News, was at a talk, had this curator was, expounding on art history as he saw it, and he turned to Linda and said, I would love to show women artists, but I can't find any good ones. Why are there no great women artists? And I think that question has really resonated, and not just within, with women, but I think, outside of the white canon, there's been a lot of restorative and recuperative histories that we are the beneficiaries of right now. So it's a great time to be doing this type of work. These are just a few books that really focus on women photographers, most recently Black women photographers in the 1980s and 90s Britain. So again, really looking both regionally, demographically, on the basis of gender, and trying to expand the ways in which we look at and remember the history of the medium. The world history of women photographers is an enormous undertaking, and in fact, it's where I can't remember, did I tell you my name? I'm Lesley Martin. I'm one of the co-editors of this, and I am currently, I started this project when I was at Aperture as creative director many years ago. I've since left Aperture for Print and Matter, and I'm the director there, very much thinking about Print and Matter is an organization dedicated to the dissemination, understanding, and appreciation of photobooks, of art books writ large, not just photobooks. But just to say, as I started this project, it was really through this, A World History of Women Photographers, that I was introduced to Pauline, because I had been working on a project inspired by my own experiences in Japan about one moment in that history, the 1990s, that I thought was really a watershed moment when young contemporary photographers were really coming to the forefront. And we worked very hard. In fact, I met Mariko Takeuchi at that time, and the photographer Yuri Nagashima, who remains a real touchstone for this current project. But we kept running into walls of how to contextualize that moment. How far back do you need to go to understand this one moment? And as that project was sort of slowing down, one of the editors of this project, World History of Women Photographers, reached out to me, asked me to write a few biographies. And I was like, I would like to do these women, Japanese women photographers. And each one I asked about, she was like, no, Pauline Vermare is doing this. So I was like, okay, I should meet this Pauline Vermare. And it was really thanks to Pauline that we were able to restructure and figure out how to address not just a single slice of history, when in fact the entire table setting had yet to be put before most people. I mean, Pauline, if you have anything to add to that.
Yes, well, just that, yes, this book, which was first published in French as Une Histoire Mondiale des Femmes Photographes by Textuel, they invited hundreds of photography historians to contribute, all women, which bothered the French journalist who wrote about the men, who said, why does it have to be women? But the point is that indeed, in France, there had never been a book about women photographers, and it was an incredible book at the time, really important, came out in 2020. And I had proposed, when I was invited, to write about a few American and Japanese photographers, I grew up in Japan, but I had never really worked in Japanese photography. I was working at ICP and Magnum. I was working more in documentary, European and American photography. But having grown up in Japan and working on this book, it occurred to me that we only knew, certainly in France and in America, not so much in Japan, but outside of Japan, we only knew Araki, Moriyama in France. These are the two names if you say Japanese photography. So, and with that comes black and white and some masculine photography, for lack of better word, something a little violent, and it's very limited. And so I said to Textuel, wouldn't it be nice to prolongate this effort and do something just about Japanese women? And Lesley, so they introduced me. In fact, the publisher said, we know someone who'd like to do this. And Lesley had been working for a few years trying to do something, as you just said. And so it was a beautiful convergence of our efforts. And this is also how we contacted Carrie Cushman and Kelly Midori McCormick, who had been working for, and you'll tell us more, but for years on the story and the history of Japanese women photographers. And this is the project that you're going to tell us about, yes, in a bit. Yeah.
Yes, and so as Pauline and I, both coming from fairly personal experience, but not specialization, we realized that we really needed scholars and people who understood this history and could speak and read Japanese at certainly a higher level than me. Pauline, you speak and read Japanese. But I continually kept hearing references to Carrie and Kelly's project behind the camera. And maybe you could just explain to us how you and Kelly, and I'll just mention that Kelly Midori McCormick is a curator or a professor at I have to look at my notes, where is she a professor?
University of British Columbia.
British Columbia, University of British Columbia. But can you tell us a little bit about this project and its focus?
Yeah, so this is a website, a digital humanities website that is hosted by the University of British Columbia, where Kelly is in the history department. The idea for it is almost 10 years old now, but it launched in 2022, I think, and it's meant to be a teaching resource, so I encourage you to go online and explore it. I'll talk more about why we decided to create a website instead of a book or an exhibition for our approach to Japanese women photographers in a little bit. But it's essentially a series of learning modules by different experts from all around the world. So you can watch a 20-minute video and get an annotated bibliography and find an image archive about the Ainu and documentary photography from the 19th century, or women's street photography in the 1980s. The issues and topics are vast, as are the number of contributors. I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, I will say the advantage of the online format is you can keep expanding it.
Exactly.
And I'll just run through a little bit first to talk about how Pauline and I got started. We traveled to Japan and began speaking, and what we discovered is that there were really people who were invested in this history, gallerists who supported women artists, people who had been doing the research, and everybody was very eager and willing to help us. That everybody wanted to see this happen and had a different little piece of the puzzle. Then through the work of the editorial committee, really looking at the array of visuals and talking about how do we condense this wide variety of materials into a single cohesive narrative story. And really what we came to is that, in fact, it should be a plurality of voices, and what we wanted to avoid was ever saying Japanese women photographers are X, that there was a long history, so many different types of styles, and that the best way through it was to gather this assemblage of the editorial committee, each of whom would write an essay taking one particular component, taking us through certain moments in the history. I'm so happy you are here by Pauline, the women who built worlds with their cameras from Carrie and Kelly. We'll hear more about that. And a very important voice and sounding board for us, Takeuchi Mariko, who wrote about dissident women. And really wanted to propose that, in fact, perhaps because women had been left out of the mainstream in some cases, they were really able to experiment and to push the boundaries of what was possible beyond just the photographic. So that was, I think, here's a couple of spreads. You can see Mariko really brought us into an exploration of people who were working with sculptural elements, with installation, with video, with performance. And so this felt like an excellent way to really round this idea of just multiple voices. The project is structured so there's these essays, and then there's we wanted it to be incredibly as engaging as we ourselves found this work. So we put together a really just visuals, portfolios from each of the 25 individual photographers who are included within. There's like 8 to 10 pages, just so you get this immersion in the visual experience, which is radically different from individual to individual, because Japanese photo history is incomplete without an expanded view of how the PhotoBook operates in relation to that history. Mark Fustel and Russet Letterman, who were also very important, put together an illustrated bibliography. And this was able to help us also expand the number of artists that we could reference. Instead of just 25, I think there are something like 80 photographers who are addressed in one way or the other. And finally, and I hope we'll have the chance to talk about the complications of doing a cross-cultural analysis that contains sometimes critical elements, and this is just there's so much time and space, you can do everything, but we thought it was very important to include works, writings by women curators and critics, and also interviews with photographers, most of which had never been translated before. And this also takes us back to the very beginning of the introduction of photography in Japan, where women played a very active part in the studios, and these are ideas that are picked up again. It's a little bit of, you find these ideas explored in lots of different ways, and that seemed to feel like the best, most fully textured way of addressing such a complicated subject. Back to Textuel, we were very glad to also launch the book simultaneously in French, and I will say at this moment that this is, as you can tell, and I'm going to go into the last part of this very quickly, which is an exhibition, but it's a tremendous undertaking, and I wanted to also thank the funders for this project, the Anne Levy Charitable Trust, and also Caring, Women in Motion, and the Rencontre d'Arles, who were our collaborators in making an exhibition that launched in France this summer. So I'm going to just close it there because I will keep talking, but I want to really get into some of the meat and potatoes and some of the ideas that were explored in the book. And Pauline, let's start with you, and then Carrie with you.
Should I go here to flip through the... I don't even have really... I mean, we have my essay as a PDF here, but maybe we don't even have to go through this. I just wanted, because Lesley, you beautifully described the project. I just wanted to maybe say what the questions were that we all discussed. What were the bigger questions when we started working on this project, and what we wanted to really explain as an introduction. So my text, my essay is really an introduction to explain where we came from, what I just told you about my growing up in Japan, and maybe realizing that working on the book, the French book, but also I worked on a master class on Japanese women photographers for the Maison Européenne de Photographie, and when I looked at all the work, I thought, this is crazy that we don't know this. And by we, I mean including myself, who, I've been working in photography for 20 years, and I know some of them, but the amount of work since the 19th century here, I should say, since the first Shima Ryu, the first Japanese woman photographer, you think it's not okay to not know, and it's quite extraordinary to look at it. And so that is the spirit of the book, was more that of a joy to share something that was not made visible before as a whole. And so Carrie and Kelly had worked on that incredible, and really please spend time on this platform that we just shared earlier and that Carrie's going to talk about. But this was an example of an incredible asset that we needed to lift up into, to share more widely, because not so much in Japan, and this book is really, the audience for the book is mostly, in the case of the Aperture edition, for an English language audience. The French book is obviously for a French and French-speaking audience. There will be a Japanese edition, we hope very soon, that should be slightly edited to talk to a Japanese audience. And what needs to be said is that many of the Japanese photographers we're talking about here are now, I mean, maybe Carrie, you can talk to this, are more well-known in Japan than they are here, certainly, and in France. And that's something to be aware of. So really our concern was, how do we introduce this incredible array of photographers in the most dynamic way to a non-Japanese audience? And how do we talk about questions of women photographers and what is a Japanese photographers and all those questions, these were big questions that we needed to establish and not quite answer, issues of feminism. What does feminism mean in America? What does it mean in France? What does it mean in Japan? This book is going to be read by many audiences, and let's ask those questions. But most importantly, let's celebrate those reverse shots, as I call them, like in cinema, and you have the camera facing this scene, and then you have the other perspective. And what really mattered to us with this book was to show the perspective of the Japanese woman, of Japanese women, on Japan, on their own daily life, on so many things, just like in any other field, any other subjects on photography. But to look at, for me, what was important, maybe because I grew up in Japan, was to show Japan that I hadn't seen through photography all these years in France and in the US. I was seeing the same Japan over and over again. And the idea to expand the field and to look at the perspective of the woman from Japan was really something that I thought was incredibly exciting and important. And when you look at this magazine, Main, these are the initials of Ishiuchi Miyako and Narahashi Asako, the two photographers who you can see on the first. You see that cover, the number 1. These are two photographers who were very important. Ishiuchi might be the one name that in America, not in France, nobody, and she was celebrated in Arles. She was a big discovery in Arles, which was interesting. Here, she's one of the more well-known photographers, women. In fact, maybe one of the few with Kawauchi Rinko, I would say, the two names that people might identify. But anyway, so Ishiuchi and Narahashi, in the 90s, I forget, in 96, I believe, March 96, started a magazine called Main, as in hand in French, to publish their own work, but also the work of many other photographers, many women, but also some men, and a very playful example of a reverse shot. You can see here Ishiuchi taking a photo of a nude, a very intimate scene, but with much wit, of Fukase, who is one of the famous men Japanese photographers. So you have in this magazine so many, a wealth of content, photographic and otherwise, text, interviews. And it was, they set up to do 10 issues, which they did. And so it was not a long run, but it's a really important publication. ICP has the whole set, and we were able to get all the reproductions. Do we have the originals in the show? Is it, yeah. And so this is part of the show also. This is a very important point also about how was the work seen. So Lesley talked about the books and the bibliography at the end of this book, the rich illustrated bibliography that Rosette Lederman and Mark Feustel put together. But this is also an example of the outlets. How was the work circulated? How was it shared? And this is a very important moment. But yes, so pretty much what we wanted, the introduction is asking the questions also about the body, because one of the things we talk about also is one of the issues that Japanese women photographers faced in terms of representation and visibility is that people systematically expected in France, particularly because Araki was mostly famous in France for a big show he had in the 90s at the Fondation Cartier pour l'Art Contemporain, and he became so popular. The cover of the catalog was a Japanese woman with the bondage, one of the his typical work. And when you say Japanese photography, the one thing is you would expect a Japanese man, not a woman. but also you would expect a woman in the photograph, and more often than not you would expect her to be naked and maybe the bondage. So that the whole sexuality, everything was problematic, and everything was going against the idea of maybe a Japanese woman being a photographer. And so that's the premise of this book, is also to reverse that, the sort of collective unconscious or something like that, and also to see how some of those Japanese women photographers played with that and with the idea of the body, the spread we were seeing earlier, with some of the photographers like Kura Masumi, who did a whole series called Men Are Beautiful as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek response to Women Are Beautiful, or Hosokura Mayumi, the one on top, who's playing with the idea of the male body, and to see how some of these photographers actually took that trope of the Japanese woman photographers not even being imagined, and then also took all of that baggage that came with it and played with it, which and did some beautiful work, very different one to the other, but quite beautiful work. And yes, I think the color, that's what I talk about. Thank you, Lesley, I appreciate you. One thing that I also remark on in the introduction is how incredible the color is, the use of the color is incredible throughout. So for instance, up here is Imai Hisai, that's the 50s, incredible photographer. Just a book just came out by Toda Masako. She edited this incredible book of her work. This is Hanayo. Anyway, I don't want to drop all the names, but look at all the range, and to look at the work, of course, Kawao Chirinko, who has a portfolio, and to examine the use of color, also comparing this to some classic sort of Nihonga, so traditional. This is a woman, Ogura Yuki, who in the 30s, I mean quite early on, was using very natural organic techniques to look at scenes of the daily life, and to look at this thread, and to look at, anyway, the use of color, I thought, is fundamental, also because when we think of Japanese photography, we go to the sort of black and white Provoke era, but we see the range since the 50s, and it's really Yamazawa, Eiko, and all of that. So in that spirit, we wanted to open the field, and that was and Hero Mix also, of course, with the color. And that was the goal of the introduction, is to lay all these maybe threads of thinking about their work, the work of all those photographers, and to think of how we can maybe think differently about Japanese photography in general, thanks to them.
Okay.
And I'll pass on to Carrie.
And Carrie, if you could maybe take us through some of the key ideas that you were thinking about as you put your essay together.
Sure. So just a little bit of background. Kelly and I met about 10 years ago when we were both in Japan doing field work for our dissertations. I'm in the world of art history, she's in history, and we were both working on Japanese photography. And started having these similar conversations. Where are the women? Where are the women? We knew the women photographers, but where were they in the histories that we were reading and researching and the archives? And had a lot of conversations, and continue to have conversations about how you begin to write them into history, or write a history of women photographers. Because you don't want to just repeat the canon. The canon is problematic in its own right, and when you then just do a canon of women, you're leaving other people out. So I don't think it's a question that we've actually resolved, but when we were invited, and we're very grateful for the opportunity, when we were invited to participate in this ambitious project, it was like this oh no moment, because we'd been avoiding writing this history and trying to figure out other ways, like I said, to write women into it. And so we came up with this idea to just keep it focused on 5 women, and this idea of world building, the women who built worlds with their cameras. And I'll say, I think world building is a phrase we hear a lot in the world of contemporary art right now. It's a very catchy phrase. Usually it comes from speculative literary genres like science fiction, fantastical realism. And in the world of contemporary art, I think often has associations with ideas of futurity, the notion that you need to build with whatever tools you have, in artist cases, artistic, creative tools, you need to build the world that you want for yourself and your community, because the one you're living in is actually quite precarious. And that's not the kind of world building we're talking about in this essay. This is a much more kind of pragmatic, literal, everyday, frankly less heroic kind of world building, where we focus on 5 women who are choosing careers in photography. They're choosing photography as a way to sustain a life for themselves, not exclusively, but in a few cases, so that they do not have to rely on men. So in the case of our essay, we explicitly say, in this case, it matters that they are women, and they voice that themselves. This first example, we're looking at a photograph from the 1860s by a woman, Shima Ryu, who, and this is a common story. She ran a portrait studio with her husband, who we see pictured here, and when he passed away, to sustain her life and continue on and not have to remarry, she took over the studio, and then moved and actually opened her own. And I love it because it's not just an example of where we get to say, look here, way back at the beginning of the medium, women were there. But it's really, really, she was clearly very talented and skilled. I mean, this is an era when in a portrait studio with the exposure times, you're just trying to get a good likeness of someone. And it's really rare to actually capture maybe a little bit of what their personality was like. The fact that there's multiple examples actually of him smiling and laughing that she was able to capture. And another wonderful example I'll point out is Yamazawa Eiko, who is, we have a lot of her writings and interviews, and she is much more vocal about the fact that she is building a career in photography, so that she does not have to be married to a man. She opens a portrait studio, a photography studio in Osaka in the 1930s after studying in the United States with Consuelo Kanaga. And here you can see her in the top right photograph. She's setting up the tripod. And then this is one of her students and assistants, Saiki Sachiko. She trained over 30 women. She only hired women to work in her studio with her. And so at least that we know of, 30 other women went on to have careers in photography because of her. And actually, Saiki Sachiko's studio is still in operation by her family members in Kyoto today. And so, like I said, Yamazawa was a lot more outspoken. She talked about the need for women to have skills so that they could take ownership of their own life. And be liberated from men. And those are words that she is using. This is not me projecting that onto her. So, something to note here is that another important point we're trying to make in this essay is how writing these histories, I think, requires expanding beyond traditional, like I said, the canon, traditional approaches to photo history and photo criticism that tend to prioritize the image over the historical context or the conditions under which these images came about. So we really want to attend to the larger social, political worlds that are made possible by engaging in a photographic practice, not necessarily just the resulting photographs. And so, some great examples of that are here. We're looking at some spreads from a magazine, a women's magazine, Fujin Koron Women's Review, that came out in the post-war years, talking about new career opportunities for women in the post-war era. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see photography being advertised as a legitimate career path for women. And I point this out to say that, along with thinking about writing history differently, it's also well, how are you going to write that history? What sort of resources are you using? And it might seem obvious, but it's not necessarily to photo historians to look outside of photography journals and photography archives when you're writing this history. But now we're seeing more and more scholars looking to women's magazines as a resource, and there you find evidence of women in the field. And so I'm not going to talk about all of the women, even though these are some of my favorites, that we focus on in the essay. But I'll just say, you know, I think what this kind of writing requires then is, you know, looking at genres that are frankly like a little less sexy than fine art photography. So things like the portrait studio, things like vernacular, everyday sort of snapshot photography. And then second, looking outside of, like I said, strictly photo archives or publications for evidence of these women elsewhere. And so it really has to be, when you think about these two things in combination, I think, and what we try to say in this essay is that it should be something that is multivocal and interdisciplinary, this new approach to writing photo history. And I think it's to Lesley and Pauline's credit that this book is certainly multivocal, because in addition to the editorial committee and the fantastic PhotoBook bibliography and the incredible translated resources in the back, which I think is, again, it's like visually the least sexy, but the thing I'm the most excited about. It is, along with the portfolios, a very, very multivocal publication. And to bring it back to the website, and I just wanted to bring in one quote that Kelly and I refer to a lot when we talk about how to rectify all of this. We talk about collectivizing knowledge production, and that's a term coined by some feminist art historians, Victoria Thorne and Amy Tobin. And on the website, we quote them. They write, "We know that collectivizing knowledge production can destabilize the belief in a singular objective authority and offer instead politically situated examinations of the past. But it also crucially allows us to disrupt our own assumptions by staging an encounter between various voices and positions." And I think the book does that so successfully, and it's what we're trying to do with, and as you said, Lesley, the website does go on. We have new modules that are coming out any day now.
Yay.
Learning how to build websites is a whole nother, let alone a book. But the reason we decided to pursue a website in the first case is because it is unending. There will be no final say that this is the history of women photographers. And hopefully all of the content that is there, as well as what's in this book, will just prompt more and more much needed research and conversations about this fantastic work of these women.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. I think that is something we came back to again and again, like, wow, there's so much more to be done, and this is just, again, a sort of laying the table for different ways of combining all of these ingredients and for hopefully doing more and more research in this sort of multivalent way.
Yes, and I think what we wanted with this project was also to trigger other projects. There was always, we knew that this was not going to be exhaustive, nor was it going to be like a final say. It was always known, you know, we knew this was going to be an open something to trigger. And so, for instance, Nagashima Yurie's book published now five years ago, only in Japanese. There was a very important text only, or I think text only, manifesto, so to speak, certainly a personal discourse about what Lesley was talking about earlier, the 90s and the consequences of that movement, or which was not a movement, but a moment. Anyway, it was only in Japanese, so only available to Japanese readers or people who can understand Japanese. And she received an email from a French publisher recently to get it translated into French and English. So that's one little victory. We think, you know, this is exactly what we wanted for this project, was to be really the beginning of something a little larger in terms of curiosity, really for people to think, oh wow, there's so much more to see, and we want to read more also. We want to understand the context more also.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's absolutely true. And again, the project does continue in all of these different ways. The exhibition, again, just closed in Arles. I'm not sure that I had that chance to mention it. I was told that 87,500 people saw it over the course of the 3 or 4 months that it was up. It's going to be opening in Den Haag in the Netherlands at the end of January. And it will be in Frankfurt after that. So I think the opportunities for people to come into contact with this work are myriad. I do want to just sort of talk through a little bit about the complications. I mean, you mentioned how we really had an English language audience in mind, but also a sense of responsibility to telling the history of a culture that we are not part of. Obviously, we had Mariko Takeuchi as a really important contributor, the voices that exist in translation, but I'm curious where you found that to be, how you approach those challenges and how you maybe problem solve writing from one perspective about another cultural setting and context.
Is that for me or for? Or
Both
for
of
me?
you. Both of you.
Oh, well.
Okay.
Well, there were many. This is a multifold, right? Because are we talking about the photographers? For instance, one question was Hanayo. I'm giving one example of a photographer who we saw when we traveled, when we took our trip to Tokyo. I was looking at in the museums and in the bookshops. There were a few photographers who had so many books, including Hanayo, like a whole shelf of book. And I had heard of her a little bit, but not that much. So the balance between who we know here, and again, this is different even between France and America. The photographers who we think we should prioritize. And that was a question for the portfolios, in fact. And we all discussed, it was Lesley, and I'm so grateful for Lesley. You brought the structure and order to the book, and beautifully so. It could have gone, and I think you talk about the essays at the end, and I was so excited about the essays, but you have to select.
But those are 10 out of
so many
that could have been there.
And so likewise for the portfolios, the question was, who are we selecting these for? For instance, Imai Hisai, who I showed earlier, the color work, she should have probably been included maybe for a Japanese audience, because Sato Masako, with whom we produced the show in Arles, she loves her, and she was insisting like this. She could have been a portfolio. So who are you doing this for? And so this was a big question, not just for the content of the essays, but also the visuals. And I don't think that there's an answer to that. I think we really tried to show the range. I think what mattered as a first big book, I should say here, we didn't mention the projects that came before this book, but Fuku Noriko did a very important project that Carrie and Kelly talk about, and we saw the visual in their essay, called An Incomplete History. So there were precedents, An Incomplete History, women photographer. So that was in 1998. There was also in 1986 a project at Lehigh University. But this we knew was going to be a project, and that was the goal certainly, that would reach a broader audience. And so when you know that you're going to reach a broader audience, you have greater responsibility in a sense to not forget people who absolutely should be, even if we know incomplete also. So I think we thought in terms of who cannot be not included, including people like Kon Michiko, who is one of the, a little bit surreal. Her universe is a bit surreal. So I feel like we really were thinking about this, about who outside of Japan. Certainly that's what I was thinking mostly of through this book and the French and American editions. Who should be seen outside of Japan that have not been seen yet or not enough. And that's going to be an interesting thing when the book, and hopefully soon enough, 2025 or 6, when the book comes out in Japan. One conversation we've been having with Takeuchi Mariko, who is our colleague, and we've been working very closely with her, and Lesley was working with her already a few years back. She said, you know, maybe when we do the Japanese version, we're going to have to edit a few things, explain what this project was originally, that it was born in the US and in France. And I think that's the thing, you know, where did it come from? What was the intention? Because I do believe it's a very sensitive, and especially when you cover, you know, going back to what I was talking about earlier, but women, you know, such huge subject as women photographers, and especially, I mean, in this case, Japanese photographer, I feel like at some point you have to pass it on. In this case, for the Japanese edition, we were saying certainly Mariko would need to take a lead on the Japanese edition. Mm-hmm. So that's more that of who is going to read and who is it for and where does it come from.
Yeah. No, all things, again, that rumbled around in our mind and conversations. I don't know, Carrie, if you want to respond to that, and then I'm also interested to hear if other people have questions for us. But
yeah, just anecdotally, I'll say I think it seems obvious, but to your question, Lesley, like really listening to the people who you're representing. I'm continue to be surprised when I go to a new interview with a photographer or an artist, and I'm really excited to talk about certain things, but then they want to show me something totally different. And so I think it's always a matter of, like an example from this book would be when I interviewed Ushiota Tokoko and wanted to talk about her early street photography, and she just wanted me to show me all of these really interesting books that her and her husband Shimao Shinzo had made
in China.
In China,
Those ones are so good.
Well,
I love them, but
yeah,
yes, very different kind of work.
Radically different. Like you're looking at this and you're like, is this like a catalog to purchase? You know, material culture from China. And so, you know, we made reference to that in the essay, how important these travels were for her and thinking about then the work that she was doing back in Japan. So yeah, really listening, and the cultural divide is real and can be hard sometimes, like especially when women share with you like horrifying stories about what it's like to be a woman in a very male-dominated field. And you know, I will feel a very American sense of outrage, but they would not use the same language that I would to describe those experiences. And we had a lot of conversations about how you have to be nuanced, even just using the word feminism in different cultural contexts. And it was a real learning experience, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, definitely. I do have other questions if nobody else does, but I'm hoping to hear from anyone in the audience questions about particular aspects of the book.
Maybe I can shout it.
Yes.
How did you learn? Well, first, before I ask my question, the preceding, leading into a question is, when was this published?
So this was just published officially. I mean, it was released in France in July, but it did not arrive in the US until October. I've lost track. Recently, and the show opened in July over the summer, so.
I was curious how it's being received, or do you have a sense of how it's being received, particularly in Japan, where there's been not much attention given to these women photographers?
So when Lesley showed us earlier, there was a festival called T3 in October, and I was really, it was exciting to see that. So they organized that show, which was revisiting the MoMA show, but including women that could have been in the show at that time. And that was a direct consequence of the book. And I feel like this, for me, was already a moment of joy, because I thought, oh, good. So it's you know, it's having, there's a wave arriving in Japan, and it's a positive one. It was festive, very much like the spirit of the book. It's nothing confrontational, it's more of a celebration, and who could have been included, and that included Imai Hisai, I mean, you saw Nishimura Tamiko, a few others, I mean, Nishiuchi, of course. So I would say, and I spoke with Sayaka, Takahashi Sayaka, who is one of the two main galleries, and they should be named as well. We didn't talk about them, but super important galleries, PGI, and Takahashi Sayaka is the head of PGI, and third gallery, Aya, which is led by Aya Tomoka. And both of them were at Paris Photo this year, the fair, and they did a booth together and showing so many women. So these are examples of how I feel like the project in general is received, is that I feel like in a way we have taken something that should have probably ideally started, it should have ideally been a Japanese publication for many reasons that Carrie just hinted at. This could not have happened because it would have taken, it would have been too complicated, for instance, for Sayaka and Tomoka to do this together. There's also Kasahara Michiko, who was at the Top Museum for many years. So there were many, many people, and men also, but many women, it should be said, that supported and promoted those Japanese women photographers for many, many years, especially since the 90s in Japan. But I feel like we kind of were a bit of an enabler. Maybe this project was, so all of us who were interested, and Carrie and Kelly, who had been working on the subject for so many years, I think together, and bringing them in, Sayaka, I mean, all these women who had been working, I feel like together I feel like what's the first part of the train, the locomotive, you call it a locomotive? The first, you know, the engine of the train, I suppose. It's like we sort of started it, and that makes me quite happy. But I want to see what the book is going to look like, because I think the Japanese edition of the book is going to be different. Just the cover, I mean, you see the difference between French and American covers is one thing, and I want to see what the Japanese book is going to be like.
I think this idea of being a catalyzer or enabler, that this was a moment to bring people who really have committed so much time and effort to nurturing artists who didn't have support systems, to doing the research that wasn't being published or seen in major museums. Like, this was that moment. It goes back to the title, and we talked a lot about the title. It comes from, this is something Pauline suggested, it comes from a poem by the photographer Rinko Kawauchi in one of her books of photographs and poems, The Eyes, the Ears. But this idea that I'm so happy you're here. It's not, this idea of a discovery as though like it didn't exist before, but an acknowledgement that here we are, and it's great that we're here together, and these artists and these histories have been here, from the beginning, and we're really glad to be able to encounter them.
In fact,
in
I
this
should say
way.
that Kelly and Carrie had the great idea of actually including the poem, because it would have been a little thank you. So I read it to you. Once in a while, we should look into each other's eyes, otherwise we might feel lost. I'm so glad that you are here. That's by Kawauchi Rinko. And we felt, when we saw that, and we thought, oh, that's pretty much how we feel too.
Carrie, anything to add to that?
Can I? Yeah. I love the term enabler. And I think you're right, Pauline, like if it was going to happen now, this is probably the context it had to happen in. Because even like another anecdote, Nagashima Yurie, the part of her very important book that Pauline mentioned that we translated for the resources section, one time I asked her, how is it being received in Japan? And she was like, well, the photo world doesn't know anything about it. It's like literary criticism and sociology that it's being reviewed in, and that I'm getting talks in. So even just like putting things into their proper context feels really important. But I have asked, I think all of the living photographers who are represented in it are thrilled. I just, receive thanks and joy, messages of joy all the time. I've heard from some scholar, one of the best, I asked how's it being received in Japan, and one of the best answers I got was, there will be a response. And I thought, yes, yes, please respond.
Awesome. Yes, sir.
Will the show come to the U.S.? Are there any plans?
We're working on it.
There should be, yes, in 2026.
Yes.
Does this event call into question the possibility for Korea, or China, or India, women photographers? Obviously, there's a whole drown.
Absolutely, it would be wonderful, and I know we spoke there anyway. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I know of a few projects that are born from and looking at archives from women photographers from other countries in Asia. Yeah.
There's two more questions. If you would like to go first, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry, I keep losing my mic.
I want to add something about how the book got received outside the US as well, because I come from Thailand and I still actively connect with someone from Thailand. One of the photo bookstore in Thailand got 5 copies from Aperture, and it sold out in 10 minutes. It's got well received because not only Japanese photography really influential in Asia, but this is one of the first time we talking on the mainstream media about how Japanese photographer, it's not only men, but also women photographer. Which leads to my answer about the choice of your cover. Because for me, I believe the first one, the English version is from Eyes and Ears, Ringo Kawaguchi books, and also the French version from her Hanabi PhotoBook. I want to ask what's your choice, what you thought about choosing her photos as a cover for both of your version, because personally for me, she changed the landscape of Japanese photography in 2000, use of color or the way she changed more of a subtle and poetic way of seeing photography. But yeah, I want to hear what you think about or what your behind the choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good to see you. I'll let Lesley respond to covers because it's more of a publishers, I would say, right?
I mean, it was a conversation also, many of these decisions. And, on one hand, you want to give somebody who's less known that opportunity. On the other hand, because you're really introducing a whole community of people, sometimes you take, you sort of ride on the coattails, so to speak, of the people, those who will be recognized. The English language cover, this is actually on this same image is on the cover of her book, The Eyes, the Ears. So we debated that. We looked at many other possibilities. It's, there are so many other conversations wrapped up in this, subtle references. I like to think of the Shin Shosetsu, I photography, the I photography is sort of represented in this, but nobody is really going to get those references or think about that. So it's really it's down to visual impact, and wanting, really the whole goal of this project was to open the door as widely as possible to a more sort of popular, because we know that this research is being done on the academic level, but how do you connect to those people who might have been, actually, there's an order here, just because we're, sorry. So that's my answer.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I'll give you this.
Given the way photography functioned as sort of liberatory social political tool for Japanese women photographers, I'm imagining that there weren't just lesser unknown photographers, but maybe unnamed and unidentified photographers. So are there efforts to maybe mine archives and do the sort of identification work?
Is this on? Yes. This is where I really have to shout out Kelly McCormick's work. She is relentless and recognized early on that, especially in the 20s and 30s, when pictorial magazines are booming, that there are so many photographs being published that don't have captions of who took them. And when we get into the wartime era, especially when so many men are gone, women were responsible for a lot of those photographs. And she, it can be quite difficult doing archival research in Japan for many reasons. One of which is you need introductions to the right people. You can't just ask. And she like I said, she's just dogged and relentless. And she was there last week and sending me photos of, she's in the grandchild of a photographer from the 50s house, scanning slides. And so, yes, like it's coming, but it's really hard work. We think of Japan as this ultra high tech place. Nothing is digitized, which is another reason that we wanted to create this website as a resource to start putting more just images out there. So yes, it's really difficult work, but it's happening by people like her.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If part of creating a community is being able to see that community, are there any galleries in Japan, Tokyo, any of the cities that feature these artists so that it's possible to be able to say, that's where I want to go when I go to Japan, and that's what I want to see?
Yeah, so those two galleries that I mentioned that that joined forces at Paris Photo, one is, I'm happy to write them down for you, PGI is in Tokyo, and they represent a good number of the photographers in the book, and the other good number is represented by another gallery called Third Gallery Aya, A-Y-A, and the owner and founder is called Aya is her last name, Tomoka is her first name. And so together, and there are more, and they're in fact here in the US, the gallery Miyako Yoshinoga, she represented a few. Who am I missing? Who are the galleries? In Paris, there's Echo 119. I can't pronounce. Anyway, Echo 119. They've been represented quite a few also. Ibasho, thank you, in Belgium. In Belgium, are they? In Antwerp, aren't they? Yes.
Antwerp.
Yeah.
And I think you'll find more women are appearing in other galleries.
Yeah.
And
Oh, and Zen. Sorry, I forgot Zen.
Zen Photo Gallery in
Tokyo.
Tokyo. But also the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Photography has an amazing library, and the head curator there, Michiko Kasahara, for many, many years was a very influential and important voice building archives and an amazing collection of the work of these women. So,
and here in New York, of course, I'm forgetting Alison Bradley, and she's been showing quite a few. She's in Chelsea. She has a space called Alison Bradley Projects. And in fact, we're hoping that when we do the Consuelo Kanaga show at the Brooklyn Museum, who was a mentor of Yamazawa Iko that Carrie mentioned, we're hoping that Alison Bradley might show the work of Yamazawa while Kanaga's show is at the Brooklyn Museum, and to have a conversation, hopefully with Carrie and Kelly, in the spring to talk about that, those conversations that happened as soon, it was the 40s, 50s that they were working together.
okay, I think that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and interest.
Thank you.